in increased consumption. So increased consumption leading to more jobs. Also, the decisions people have taken to reduce their participation in the labour force have largely been concerned with doing so because of health issues, to deal with caring responsibilities, or to engage or maintain an engagement with education. And I want to say something about that, because that really has been found to be quite significant where teenagers are concerned. And one of the things that the UBI pilots have shown is that teenagers are more likely to stay in education if they are receiving a UBI. And one of the things that we know happens when people stay in education, and the longer they stay in it, is that obviously there is the link to getting a better income because they have more skills. And I think given what has been said about the advent of AI, this is particularly important. We also know that those who stay on in education are more likely to see better health benefits, to have better adult health, and to have better sort of cognitive function as they go into old age. So, you know, it might sound as if staying in education is a small thing, but the spillover effects in terms of skills acquisition and all the other implications are really substantial. I don't want to say too much about the mental health issues because I think they have been spoken about beautifully. But yes, as Sophie has said, the findings all show that health benefits, mental and physical, improve for those who are on the receiving end of a UBI. The other thing that I think would be really interesting, and I know my colleagues at Exeter are quite keen to do this, one of the things we would like to do as a kind of part of a putative pilot is to look at what people did who were furloughed during the pandemic. I think also to try and address this issue about the idea that if you give people money, they don't really necessarily do anything with it. One of the things I've noticed with people who were on furlough during the pandemic is that they didn't sit on their backsides watching box sets. Many of them started to engage in upskilling. And some of it might have been as banal as cooking and engaging in cooking. I mean, I saw loads of pictures of people sourdough, the meals they were cooking. And whilst it's, you know, it's something that I laugh at, actually that's quite a serious point to make, that if you have time, do you start engaging in skills, however small they might be? So cooking more healthily, exercising. I was seeing people who were starting to grow their own food. It would be really interesting to, I think, to examine what people have done during furlough, because I'm sure that actually we would see that people have been engaging in some form of skills acquisition during this time. And I think I would like to finish by arguing for a feasibility study to inform a UBI pilot. Everything that my colleagues and I have found about UBI suggests that this is an idea that has now really come of age. And I completely support Jack and Sophie in terms of this, their interest in UBI, and we need to really start thinking about how we take this further in Wales.
Thank you, Sarah. Really, really interesting points again. I think two for me really was your first point about how the way people think in the trials and what the evidence suggests. So we're already seeing a societal change about how we think as human beings. And then finally, your point on a feasibility study. I do believe that is a strong point to make, and I think it's one we can make as a collective group, perhaps. And also, I should add your question regarding what people are doing in furlough. Perhaps we may get to that during the question and answer session from the audience. And if not, perhaps people could maybe send my office comments and we could share them with your team as well. I'd like to pass over to Hannah McCarthy. Now she's studying in Cardiff University a master's degree in Welsh Government and Politics. And I think you're going to do a perspective of a younger person on our future generations, Hannah. So over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. So I'd like to start by saying that I'm probably not an expert in a UBI, but I would like to share with you some of the points that I found really interesting when researching a UBI, in particular from the position of a young woman who's also a student. So to provide some context on where my views are coming from, I'm sure many of you are aware that as young people today, we are consistently told how our quality of life won't be as good as our parents, how our wages won't be as high, and that we are unlikely to be able to afford our own homes. And I know from my personal point of view that I'm kind of fed up of hearing that graduating in 2020 is the new 2008, and that the prospect of securing a job will be slim. And it's interesting actually that when I first heard about a UBI in a second year political philosophy lecture, I didn't think of it particularly as a solution for my generation's problems. I sort of saw it as an interesting utopian idea. However, as a UBI has entered the mainstream political conversation, I've picked up on people like Jack and the points that they've made and how a UBI could be used to help with the current pandemic. So for a start, a UBI gives people the freedom to explore the options that they wouldn't currently be able to. For instance, many people are unable to retrain in different professions or explore a business idea or even dedicate some time to volunteering due to financial stress. And I think, as Dr. Gilmore's picked up, we've seen during the pandemic how people have used time away from work to help others and have tried to learn new skills or explore new hobbies. And I just thought to myself, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could continue this after lockdown and continue helping each other and putting good vibes out to the world and helping each other. And the ability to retrain is a benefit for everyone. And I think was mentioned before the studies in Canada that show that young people are more likely to remain in education whilst receiving a UBI, as they aren't under the same level of pressure to enter low paid work in order to afford the basics and help out financially at home with their parents. This also links to the fact that young people are far more likely to face wage discrimination in their jobs, being paid less for doing the same work as their colleagues, and we see this in minimum wage levels that are set by the government. A UBI will help lessen the impact of wage discrimination, giving us a solid foundation from which we can build. Currently, low wages and 0 hours contracts make it incredibly difficult for young people to be financially stable, and this impacts things like achieving a mortgage. A UBI would bring certainty for these people, knowing that whatever hours you are assigned, bills will be paid and food will be put on the table, and you aren't having to worry whether next week's pay will be the same as last. A statistic that actually startled me quite a lot recently is that 40% of tenants in private housing in Wales have fallen into rent arrears during lockdown. And it's actually really scary to think of what will happen to these thousands of people once the eviction pause is ended in August. And I think it shows the way that our system is skewed, that homeowners have been given mortgage breaks, but the same financial assistance hasn't been afforded to people like me who are renting. The UBI would ensure at the very least, when times are tough, people can have a roof over their heads and food to eat. I'd also like to touch on the possible implementation of a UBI, as I'm sure many of you may be in the position that I was until recently, that this all sounds very lovely, but how would it work in practice? And I think to answer that, it's important to recognise that the current system itself isn't working and that we shouldn't just simply accept it as it is. In fact, the current system, and particularly universal credit, fails to protect the most vulnerable people in our society. For instance, because the payments are made to households under universal credit, not individuals, those trapped in abusive relationships can become stuck, unable to leave partners because they do not have their own financial agency. Whereas a UBI would restore these women's ability to make these already incredibly difficult decisions to leave such a hard situation. Another issue with the current system is that huge amounts of money is constantly spent on the levels of bureaucracy, constantly checking up on people that they are actively seeking jobs, or checking that their disability status remains the same. And not only is this such a waste of money constantly making these checks, but it's also incredibly insensitive and really upsetting for those people that are constantly having to prove their situation. A UBI would remove this layer of bureaucracy, as everybody would be receiving the same, no matter what their status. It would also remove the stigma surrounding receiving welfare payments, placing everyone on a level playing field and removing the us as taxpayers versus them as welfare recipients that we've seen in the media a lot. On top of this, as we've mentioned before, a Finnish study shows that people aren't less likely to work when receiving a UBI. It's simply a platform from which they can build. And the payoff is that stress levels are reduced and people have a quality of life which is significantly improved. Overall, whilst I think coronavirus presents one of the biggest challenges the modern world has ever faced, it is also an opportunity to change these grim predictions that we've all been given for years, and that we can change the system and make it one that actively works for people instead of against them. Now, as Jack points out, is the time for a radical and new system that will listen and mitigate the concerns of the younger generation rather than continuing to ignore them.
Thank you, Hannah Diop. I think you made some very, very clear and valid points on that. Your ending comment on creating what's happened with to society because of the coronavirus pandemic, and turning actually those challenges into opportunity. And I think this is the time to be bold, and it's the time for us all to be bold and do that. But your particular point that's stuck in my mind, and I've had this conversation with you earlier and before this call, was your point on domestic violence, a pandemic in itself. And I think that is a very, very important thing that we could think about. And it's these little things. I mentioned automation and where I come from, but as I said earlier, there's a lot more into this and a lot more that a UBI could benefit people from. And that is one of the an example that should be on the top of everyone's priority list to end. And if UBI helps that in any way, then I think we should all be pushing strongly for one. Just before I pass over to our final guest speaker, I think it's really interesting that during our conversation today, we've actually seen two future generations on the screen. So I just noticed little Belle on the screen there, Sophie's daughter. So welcome to Belle. It's great to have your avid interest in this as well. So the more we can do to support our future generations as well, that's really important. So final guest speaker before we enter into our Q&A, Mark Cooper. Mark, you're really interested in a UBI. You run your own Twitter account, Basic Income Wales. We're really excited to hear from you and your views on this.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks for inviting me. And it's one of those things, coming last gives you a chance to listen to what everyone else has said and reflect on it. And even though it's only been a few minutes, I think there were some really strong points that were made in there. And I think linking UBI to a 4-day week is important as well. I ran an organisation that did just that, where we paid people the same amount and paid for it, and we all worked a 4-day week, and people chose to use it in different ways. And it just shows that sometimes it doesn't take necessarily government action. It doesn't even take individuals. You can change your world and make a difference, and it's about telling the stories that make a difference as well. But I think this is interesting. We're in a really interesting place. COVID has brought basic income to the fore. But in my opinion, basic income was needed 2 or 3 years ago. This is our economy isn't working. It's not working for too many people. Wales is getting to a point where we're about to hit 40% child poverty, and poverty is endemic. It stays. It's generational. So that when your parents are in poverty, when you grow up as a child, the chances are you will stay in poverty, because meritocracy as a thing doesn't exist. It keeps people there. So we have a real issue. We also have an issue, and this was touched on with Sophie as well, the climate change issues that we have ahead of us. We've got to find different ways of solving the problem, and growth as an objective all the time may not be the right way of doing it. In fact, there's no way at the moment to take growth and climate chaos and separate the two. When we talk about growth, we will be increasing the problems for the climate. So the UBI could be a way of taking demand out of the economy in some ways as well. And I also think that we've got an opportunity to look at issues of inequality, because even in a country like Wales, well, we don't have the same levels of inequality as you may have in England. We still do have inequality. There are too many people with and too many people completely without. So we've got a chance to change things. But this isn't a new issue. You know, this is Martin Luther King called for a UBI in the 60s. Richard Nixon, you know, the Republican president, almost introduced a universal basic income. So this isn't something that's just come about. This is something that's been around for a while. And in Wales, you know, the Green Party of Wales have been calling for it forever. Jane Dodds, the leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats, has been an advocate for the last 5 or 6 years. And Plaid Cymru have had it as a proposal. Mark Drakeford says he liked the idea when he was finance minister and was interested in it. And only a few weeks ago, Ken Skates said he was interested in the idea and would like to see what the sums looks like. So this isn't new, but it's very much of its time. I have some concerns about when we talk about trials, and I worry sometimes that we set the level too low. I think there is an opportunity for us to treat this as a way of solving problems. And you look at what do you actually need to survive, and there's been some work done on the minimum income levels needed. And they talk about an adult needing £213 a week. So for a basic income to be truly emancipatory and actually enable us to